Good evening. I'm Marion Dry, Chair of Class Act HR 73, and it is my honor to welcome you to this Class Act Forum, Voter Suppression, a Cancer in Our Body Politic. It is wonderful to resume our forum series after the summer hiatus. We created this series to bring experts and activists together to educate all of us about the issues we face in this complicated time and to provide us with strategic information about actions we can take to contribute to making this a better world. I would now like to introduce our panelists and our moderator. Congressman Joaquin Castro, HLS 2000, is the United States Congressman for the 20th District of Texas, which includes San Antonio, Texas. Congressman Castro was a key member of the House Intelligence Committee's investigation into Russian interference in the 2016 election, and he has been a leading voice to combat election-related misinformation and disinformation and protect the right to vote. Cecile Schoon, class of '81, president of the League of Women Voters of Florida, is on the front lines of voting rights. She is currently a civil rights attorney in Panama City, Florida. Samuel Spital, 2000 and HLS 2004, is the director of litigation at the NAACP Legal Defense and Educational Fund. Sam has extensive experience in a wide range of civil rights litigation and has been a lecturer in law at Columbia Law School. Finally, Michael Waldman, president of the Brennan Center for Justice at NYU Law School, has led the center since 2005. His most recent book, The Fight to Vote, is a history of the struggle to win voting rights for all citizens. And our moderator, E.J. Dion, a fellow HR 73 classmate and the renowned Washington Post columnist, is a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution and university professor at Georgetown University's McCourt School of Public Policy. E.J.'s most recent book, with co-author Miles Rappaport, 100% Democracy, The Case for Universal Voting, is squarely on topic for tonight's discussion. It is now my great pleasure to welcome you, EJ, to begin the discussion.
First of all, Marianne, bless you for holding up that book. Thank you very much. And I can't tell you what an honor it is for me to be here tonight with so many of my classmates, with this extraordinary panel full of people I deeply admire, and with Class Act, which is really an extraordinary commitment of a class to social justice, to civic action, and to democratic engagement. It's really appropriate that Class Act is sponsoring this program tonight. I'm only going to say three things quickly in introducing the event before I turn to our distinguished guests. The first is I had occasion to read a book that just came out from Jed Purdy, who is, by our standards, a young scholar by class of 73 standards, not Congressman Castro standards, a young scholar at Columbia who had just asked the question for us. He asked, what does it mean to put democracy first? It means asking whether our culture, our economy, and our politics help us to see one another as equals who can rule together. It means recognizing how culture, economy, and politics can undercut both democratic equality and the civic solidarity and trust people need if they are to rule together. It means unlearning the habit of imagining that things will take care of themselves and that crises will ease spontaneously, that political responses are unnecessary and dangerous, and that in any case, we really cannot rule ourselves and should not try. These ideas have worked themselves deep into our thinking. We cannot afford to assume they are true. I think those are great words to start with tonight. And I just want to say two other things, that democracy is a lot easier to save when you have it than to get back when you lose it. And that's why what we're talking about tonight is so critical. And the biggest threats to democracy often come not in some great conflagration, but in a slow, steady unraveling of voting rights. A little change here, long lines there. Oh, we're only disenfranchising ex-felons. Oh, we are only getting rid of a few days of Sunday voting. And suddenly all these things together become a severe restriction on people's right to vote. And those are many of the things we're going to be talking about tonight. So I'm going to turn to Michael Wallman, who has done both personally and through the Brennan Center some of the most extraordinary work on this topic. Every democracy advocate depends on the work of the Brennan Center. I say that as a heavy consumer myself. Michael, could you give us an overview of trends in voter suppression? It sounds almost like a corporate presentation. Trends in voter suppression, and talking about the strange split since 2020, where some states have improved even on the expanded voting of 2020 and others have pulled back. Thanks for being with us, Michael.
Thank you for your kind words. Thank you to Class Act 73 for what you're doing. The trend lines, I guess I should say, skinny jeans are out and baggy pants are in, but unfortunately voter suppression is in as well. We are, I believe, in the midst as a country of a great fight for the future of constitutional democracy. Right now, we are fighting over first principles in a way that we have not in a long time, and in a way that I suspect very few of us expected to be fighting and addressing at this stage. You know, we've fought over the shape of our democracy from the beginning of the country. From the very beginning, there have been people who've demanded a seat at the table and to have their voices heard, and there have been people pushing back and trying to restrict that access to power and to full citizenship. But in a lot of ways, I suspect when all of you were in school, when I was in school, the issue of voting and voting rights, especially after the Voting Rights Act of 1965, that was sort of for the history books and not current events. But as we know, in the past 2 decades, and especially in the past few years, there's been a growing and increasing and an increasingly virulent attack on the right to vote. It is in response, in some respects, to the changes in our country, to the demographic changes, to the fact that more and more of the country are people of color or younger or changing. And we saw it. This did not actually start with Donald Trump. People forget that, for example, there was enough of a scandal over phony allegations of voter fraud when prosecutors were ordered to bring charges against non-existent voter fraud. It was enough of a scandal that the Attorney General of the United States had, Attorney General Gonzalez had to resign in 2006. But we really saw this come to a boil in the last few years. The 2020 election was quite an extraordinary thing for our country. We all remember, of course, whatever we thought was going to be happening at the beginning of 2020, we knew there'd be a high turnout, but it became clear right away at the beginning of the pandemic that we might not have a free and fair election in November because of COVID, because of the crushing impact on turnout and even on people showing up to work at the polls. It was extraordinarily important to expand access to vote by mail, so everybody had the chance to do it, to expand access to early voting, to have safe in-person polling places, which turned out in the end to be arenas and big box stores. The whole of society, Democrats and Republicans, really mobilized. The business community, for example, recruited hundreds of thousands of people to be poll workers. And so that in the end, in November, despite the pandemic, it was the highest voter turnout since 1900 in our country. And the Department of Homeland Security under President Trump said it was the most secure election ever. Now, I kind of thought everybody should get a medal. That wasn't the only response. As we know, the loudest response in some ways was the former president, his big lie, his claim of massive voter fraud and that the election was stolen, the insurrection driven by that big lie on January 6th. And then last year, in states all across the country, a wave of new laws aiming to restrict the vote, also driven by that big lie. Now, these were somewhat, you might want to almost call them traditional voter suppression laws, in cutting back on early voting, cutting back on voter registration in ways that especially targeted communities of color. Some of these laws were worse than others. Some of them were softened as they went through, but they really did nevertheless target. But on top of that was something new, and I would suggest ominous, which is laws that changed who counts the votes, laws that changed or wanted to change the certification of elections. These, to me, have a whiff of authoritarianism. Altogether, 18 states passed 34 laws since the beginning of last year to make it harder to vote. What's the response? Well, one response, as it has been throughout the country's history, is federal legislation. And there was legislation that passed the House of Representatives. President Biden was willing to sign it. It actually had a majority of the Senate that would set national voting standards, restore the Voting Rights Act, which had been gutted by the US Supreme Court, ban gerrymandering and other things too. It did not have enough votes to overcome a filibuster, however, because Senator Manchin and Senator Sinema, even though they supported it, would not do that. And so the consequence of that is if Congress cannot protect voting rights because of the filibuster, even when there's a majority, and the federal courts will not protect voting rights because they will not. This Supreme Court majority has been actively hostile over and over again to voting rights. Then states have a green light to do their worst. And there's every reason to think that these fights will continue and that state legislative majorities will seek to abuse the rights of their own people. There are many fights that we'll discuss during this important conversation, but that's where we're at right now. How will it affect the election? We don't know, but it's something every American should care about, and increasingly people do.
Michael, thank you so much. It is a great paradox that the 18, 19 states have pulled back from the gains, and 25 states have gone forward and expanded further access to voting. And that's the kind of what's happening in our country now. Cecile is doing a lot of work in one of the states that has pulled them back. Cecile is with the League of Women Voters, which I think is one of the most fascinating organizations in our history, because it was radical and then it was very mainstream civic. And now it's radical again. It was radical because women didn't have the right to vote for a majority of our country's history. And then it became mainstream civic. They helped people register to vote. They conducted voter registration drives. Suddenly helping people to vote is radical again. And it is great that you are doing that work. It's still civic. Please talk to us about what Florida has passed that make voting more difficult, that suppress voting. How does this work? What groups are targeted, and what you and other groups are doing to fight back?
Well, thank you for this opportunity to share what's going on in Florida. I guess I'll start with Judge Walker's recent 288-page order and on a Senate Bill 90 litigation that we had, which was what we considered a form of voter suppression a couple of years ago. And we're in that litigation. It's up on appeal, but the judge, we had a resounding victory in the trial level. The judge literally found that there were over 20 years of intentional discrimination against African-American voters done intentionally by our legislators who had been predominantly controlled by the Republican Party. And the reason why he found that he made that finding is he heard evidence where he asked the senators, well, did you know how different groups voted? And they said, yes. We asked the Division of Elections and we knew how Blacks voted, we knew how wealthy whites, we knew different demographics. And interestingly and scary, the ways that Black people were increasing their voting, whether it be the souls to the polls, the Sunday voting, or drop boxes, or early voting, whenever there was an increase in Black voting, within a year, there would be a targeted legislative effort to limit that pathway. And so that is why the judge found that overwhelming crushing of the Black vote. And he basically said, it's not necessarily that these people don't like Black people. They want to control power, and the affinity with so many Black American, African-American votes with the Democratic Party, that was their methodology. So we've had a series of laws that have been passed that have been choking off the Black vote. Early voting has been limited, cutting back on souls to the polls, the Sundays. In many of our counties, it's just one Sunday, and that makes a big difference. Making it a felony to assist someone by turning in their ballot. Even used to be perfectly fine if you were not paid, no problem. But now if you possess more than 2 outside of your family, that is a felony. And in Florida, when you get a felony, you cannot vote. So it has been a continuing attack, and it has been targeting the African-American voters more than any other. In addition, there's been legislation over the years, and the latest one is Senate Bill 524, that is raising the penalty against what we have in Florida, third-party voter registrant organizations. And if you don't turn in the application a day late, or you do something, some technical violation, the annual maximum penalty used to be $1,000 for the organization or the individual. Well, just recently, they raised it to $50,000, which we are very concerned is going to be, it's chilling to us, and certainly the small groups that are volunteering and trying to do voter registration, we're concerned. Add that to the creation of the election police, which, you know, was a big battle, and it was scaled down a little bit, but now we have individuals who can, they get a complaint, and we've had a lot of complaints that don't have a lot of strength. So they get a complaint, and they're allowed to go and question the supervisor of elections or question other people. And we've had some recent arrests of people who, of our former felons who were given wrong information to vote. So it's been a ramping up, essentially, of attacking voters. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And we're going to go back to Florida and Texas and other places. And Congressman Castro is going to talk to us about what's happening in Congress and in Texas. I have to say, I have a soft spot for the 2 Castro brothers in our politics because I utterly admire their own admiration for their mother, Rosie. Their mother, Rosie, was an extraordinary activist in Texas. She ran for the city council as a candidate of the Committee for Barrio Development. She was also active in La Raza Unida. I sometimes think she must think you guys have gone so establishment, but they have been very true to her mission of social change and social action. And so I always enjoy being with you, Congressman. Would you talk? You've been outspoken about attacks on voting rights in general, and especially in Texas with Senate Bill 1 last year. It sets up all kinds of criminal penalties, just like the law in Florida for voter assistance. It prohibits drive-through voting. It makes it harder for voters to cast ballots by mail, when in fact Texas, and particularly in Houston, had done extraordinary things to make it easier for people to vote. So talk to us about the impact of SB 1, what you're doing about it, and what we need to do about voting rights generally in our nation. And thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thank you, EJ, and thank you for all of your work and commentary over the years and the books and everything and the study of this issue. And also, it's an honor to be here with everybody from the class of '73. I wish my classes were as organized as y'all are, but it's an honor to be with y'all. It has been a long slog in Texas. You know, you mentioned my mom. My mom was part of the Mexican-American civil rights movement in Texas in the 1960s and 70s. And they were fighting a lot of these same issues: voter suppression, gerrymandering, basically the denial or the attack of voting rights during those decades. And it's almost as if we've come full circle now in Texas and in other parts of the country. And so let me give you a sense, really over about the last dozen years or so, of what's been going on in Texas and why I think Texas has been ground zero for a lot of these voter suppression efforts. So I got into the Texas legislature when I was 23 years old in 2000 or 28 years old, I'm sorry, in 2003. And so I served 10 years there, and I'm now in my 10th year in the Congress. And starting around 2011, the Republicans were successful in passing a slate of voter suppression laws. The one that got the most attention, of course, was voter ID. And so obviously we know that voter ID, basically like other voter suppression tactics, is kind of a point shaving tactic. In other words, with voter ID, for example, you know that 96% of people may be able to get that ID that they need to go vote on election day or go vote early, but you know there's going to be a certain percentage of people who aren't going to have their ID that day, or they lost their driver's license, or they go and they show up, they don't have the ID and they can't make it back because they got to go to work, so they end up not voting. Well, so Republicans set up a bunch of point shaving ways to try to hold on to power. So it wasn't just voter ID, it was other kind of what I would call behind the scenes tactics. So for example, let me give you a concrete example. It used to be in Texas, just like it is in other places, that if you were deputized to register people to vote, if I was deputized in Bexar County, I could go register people throughout the state to register. Now, what they did in 2011 was they made it so that there are 254 counties in Texas. Wherever you want to register voters, you have to be deputized in that specific county. And so it was a way to put different obstacles in place to make it harder, not only to get to have people vote, but also to register them and to mobilize them. As Cecile mentioned, there are also now criminal penalties for friends or relatives who may be trying to help somebody vote by mail, for example. They also, over the years, cut down on the number of polling sites in different places in Texas. And so it has been just obstacle after obstacle that has been put in the way of people in Texas being able to vote. One of the most pernicious ones is that you still can't register online to vote in Texas. I mean, you can do everything else. You can pay your fees, you can renew your driver's license, all of these things, but you can't register to vote. And so it's an amazing way, very pernicious ways that they have been able to stunt voting in Texas. Because of that, we've got still one of the lowest participation rates. We're constantly ranked in the bottom 5 states in voter participation. And these tactics are a big part of why. But I should say, because I think it was Michael that mentioned the big lie, and I was part of the second impeachment trial team in the Senate that sought the impeachment of President Trump, or the conviction of President Trump. But Republicans in many states have moved. I would call these tactics that I just described, that Cecile described, these are tactics to try to shape your reality or shape the voting outcome. That's one thing, and those are bad enough. But they've moved beyond just trying to shape the outcome to trying to imagine the outcome now. Like, even when they lose, now they're imagining an outcome and trying to make that the reality. And that was what the big lie is you lose and then still claim that you won, which is obviously fantastical, and an even greater escalation, I would say, than even passing laws in a legislature to make it tougher to vote. Now you're just imagining an outcome. You're imagining a reality. And I think that's what makes it so dangerous to our democracy, is that you move beyond even just passing laws in a legislature, which again are horrible enough because you're making it harder to vote and mobilize people and register people. But now you're still losing and you're imagining a completely different outcome, and you're selling that outcome. I think that's what Donald Trump added to the mix. Is that, I think you're right. I mean, like I said, these things have been going on for years. Gerrymandering has been going on for decades, as you all know, right? So that's nothing new. But what changed is that he really sold the imagination of an outcome, a false reality. And since then, Republicans have picked up that mantle and are running with it. And I would argue now that in many places, the price of admission into winning the nomination in a Republican primary for a congressional seat, certainly, but also in other races, is that you have to be willing to imagine that false outcome. And you'll see this happen when a TV interviewer asks some Republicans, was Joe Biden elected president? And some of them won't say yes. Some will concede Joe Biden is the president, but they don't want to have to say Joe Biden actually won the election, because then they feel like they're going to betray Donald Trump and all of his folks will come down on them in the primary and so forth. So that, to me, is what makes these things, what makes our democracy, what puts it in such peril, is that you're no longer dealing with a lot of people that are in a reality.
Thank you so much. You give new meaning to John Lennon's song. It's the imagining reality is a very interesting way to put it. Sam, we are very grateful that you're here. I have a particular love for the LDF. I used to argue politics with my dad, and I asked him to help me strengthen my side of the argument. So I subscribed to the New Republic, which got me a fundraising note from LDF. So that one of the first contributions I ever made, I think it's the first, when I was 13, is I put $1 in the envelope and sent it back to the LDF. And I probably cost the LDF more money just by sending back my $1. But Sam is extraordinary. He's taught classes at Columbia on death penalty and prison litigation. He clerked for Justice John Paul Stevens, and he is now at the forefront of LDF litigation around voting. So LDF is fighting these laws all over the country. Can you talk to us about what you're doing to challenge these laws, what should people be doing around the country about these things? Again, thanks so much for being with us.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you for that contribution. It obviously meant a lot to you, and it means a lot to us. So I think, and let me also say thank you to the class of '73, echoing what Representative Castro said about wishing that my class were more organized, and just what an honor it really is to be here with this amazing panel.
By the way, I want to thank both of you for not saying that we look very well preserved, as somebody from a later class once said at an event I was at. So that's very good of you. Thank you.
Well, I think I will circle back to something that Michael said at the beginning, which is that the Legal Defense Fund is a nonpartisan organization that has been dedicated to fighting voter suppression really since its founding in 1940. And we have seen, as Cecile said, that voter suppression has been a tool of power, of manipulation, and that Black voters in particular have been targeted throughout our nation's history. And there's been really sad examples of both major parties sort of engaging in voter suppression historically. I think that, as Michael said, at least for me, I have not expected that I would be living in this moment where this wave of voter suppression would be so persistent and would affect so many different states sort of simultaneously. And that has presented unique challenges, I think, to LDF and I think to civil rights advocates more generally. There have been two major ways in which we have tried to respond. One has been sort of the most obvious, which is filing lawsuits. And you heard Cecile talk about the lawsuit in Florida, which is a case that LDF is also involved in. There's a lawsuit in Texas challenging the voter suppression law that was passed there that you heard Representative Castro talk about. LDF has a lawsuit and that the Brennan Center is involved in that case as well. There's a lawsuit in Georgia challenging the voter suppression law that was passed there that LDF and other organizations are working on. And so there's just been one of the important responses is to identify the ways in which these laws are targeting Black voters, other voters of color. They are, one of the sort of, I think, through lines that you see and that you heard all the other panelists talk about in some way was that the new wave of voter suppression is in some way a new poison in an old bottle, or if that's the right metaphor, because the ways in which, at the margins perhaps, but in significant ways, legislators are seeking to shape the electorate and make it more difficult is highly correlated with race. And one of the kind of big themes I think that we saw was that prior to the 2020 election and prior to the pandemic, white voters were disproportionately likely to use a number of alternative, what maybe a lot of people think of as alternative kinds of voting, voting by mail, early voting, things like that. And when we saw with the 2020 election that Black voters and other voters of color started using those methods much more, well, that's when the legislature all of a sudden decided, oh, we don't like that anymore. Florida being a really, really powerful example. And that's kind of what we've seen, I think, in state after state. And what was so important about Judge Walker's ruling that you heard Cecile talk about before, I think, as she described very powerfully, was that he really identified the ways in which the legislature was intending to target Black voters, which is a clear violation of the Equal Protection Clause, clearly unconstitutional. We have other ways that legislators are responding that are also racially targeted and also violating other core constitutional guarantees. In Georgia, one of the things that is the most shocking, I think, about the voter suppression law is criminalizing efforts to provide food or water to voters within 25 feet, to approach a voter within 25 feet and offer food and water to the voter. And Georgia is a place that has had incredibly long lines to vote. Those lines tend to be disproportionately long for voters of color. And now if you're an organization that wants to provide some basic food and water, you're not permitted to do so, and you're actually being criminalized for doing so. So these are all things that require litigative response. And then the last thing I'll just say very quickly is that it's also very important that civil rights organizations and others are pushing back during the legislative process as well, because as egregious as a lot of these laws have been, they have been to some degree modified or softened because of the pushback that I think we did see during the legislative process.
Thank you so much for that. An election lawyer once famously said that long lines are voter suppression in action. And it is really striking how those lines happen to show up disproportionately in minority neighborhoods around the country and in poor neighborhoods generally. Just so everybody knows, I am getting questions. Your questions are coming in. I'm going to turn to one of them right away. I'm going to do another round with one-to-one, one question to each panelist. Then we're going to have a discussion. We're going to reserve time for nothing but your questions, but I will bring some of them in as we go along. So I want to go back to Congressman Castro. And there are a couple of things I wanted to ask you. And one question in particular came up. Your Imagine idea hit one of our, Donna, one of our listeners tonight, who wanted to know, why do you think so many believe in the imaginary outcomes of elections? What tactics have been used to convince people of that reality? But I also want to ask you about your concerns on the growing amount of disinformation targeted to the Latino electorate, and how you think misinformation can lead to voter suppression. And as we go, I'd like us to turn to the very practical matter, and this is addressed to everybody. We're stuck with these laws in some states. We've got an election in less than 2 months. We got to make it as easy as possible for people to vote under, in many places, very trying circumstances. If everybody could keep that question in the back of their heads as you answer, I think that would be useful. But Congressman Castro, that sort of triple question I've asked you, how do people get persuaded about imaginary elections, your concerns about misinformation, particularly targeted at Latinos, and what the heck you're doing about it in Texas between now and the election? And all of that in 4 minutes, so you can do it.
So I guess really quick, I mean, what we're doing about it. So a few things. Well, we're continuing to organize, continue to do everything that we can to register people and mobilize people. With respect to Latinos, it's been a huge problem, particularly in Spanish-speaking communities. And so you think about all of the work that went in mostly after the 2016 election, when there was incredible Russian interference and so forth, into cleaning out the disinformation, although there's still a lot out there, but cleaning out the disinformation from social media in English. Well, that same effort was not put into the different foreign languages. And so there's still a lot of disinformation in Spanish radio, on Facebook, on TikTok, and different social media companies or platforms. And that continues to be a huge plague for the voting environment for Spanish speakers. And so Debbie Mercosur-Powell, a former congresswoman, and I asked the FBI to investigate that very thing, which is disinformation in Spanish language media, from radio to social media platforms. So we've continued to push for that. Again, there's been a disparate treatment in handling misinformation in English versus handling it in Spanish and other foreign languages. And so that's as big a problem as it is and continues to be in English. It's even a larger problem in Spanish and other foreign languages in the United States. And so we got to continue to address that and shed light on it. And then really quickly to the issue about how they're able to do that. I think the fact that you have a lot more news channels and sources of information now, that information is siloed for people and they're drawn to what they agree with, allows information, including inaccurate and false information and lies, to be repeated over and over and over and essentially turned into a reality for people. And I think that's what you see. And you saw Donald Trump, he continues to repeat a lie over and over and over, and particularly media outlets that are sympathetic to his cause just repeat it for him. And so then it takes on this sheath of truth, and a lot of people accept that, and they buy into it as if it is reality. And that's what we face today.
Thank you so much. I want to, by the way, tell everybody who's watching, there's a very vigorous conversation going on in the chat, and also a lot of information popping up there for those of you who want to take a look over there. Sam, as you know, I wanted to ask you about what kind of success you're having, and I want to also ask you about what can be done between now in the election. But we have two excellent questions that popped up that I know you and Michael Wallman will want to address. Rhonda asks, I'm using first names in case people don't want their names mentioned, but I want to acknowledge you for the question. Rhonda asked, are you concerned that the Supreme Court will rule that state legislatures can have full authority over federal elections, the independent state legislator theory, which you can explain? And Gordon asks, why isn't disregard of the voter prohibited by the Constitution? Which is an interesting question, actually. The Constitution doesn't really convey the right to vote for president, as the Supreme Court told us in Bush v. Gore. So why don't you take those and tell us what you're doing, what hope we have here, especially given the Supreme Court, which has shown, let's put it, remarkably little sympathy for expanding voting rights. I think that's charitable, actually. Go ahead.
Yeah, so there's a lot there, and it's also a challenging time to be hopeful with the Supreme Court. So I'll briefly talk about the independent state legislature doctrine issue, perhaps, and then if Michael wants to take the more fundamental right to vote question. So there's a case before the Supreme Court that's going to be argued this term about this concept called the independent state legislator doctrine. And the case arises out of North Carolina. It's actually about gerrymandering, not about sort of access to the polls directly. And what happened in North Carolina was that the North Carolina legislature gerrymandered very dramatically their congressional districts, such that even though the state is pretty divided equally on partisan lines, the Republicans would control the vast majority of congressional seats. And the United States Supreme Court had previously held that the federal courts were not going to be able to intervene in those kinds of disputes, calling them non-justiciable. But they said, state courts, this is an area where you can go to state court. And the North Carolina Supreme Court took up that mantle and held that under the North Carolina Constitution, this kind of partisan gerrymandering was unconstitutional, and the court required the state legislature to redraw the lines so that they would be pretty fair, so that they would reflect the partisan divide in the country. There is a very radical notion now that some plaintiffs in that case are pushing, representing the legislature, that, well, actually, notwithstanding what the US Supreme Court said previously about the role of state courts here, state courts have no role to play in this kind of a case, because under the Elections Clause in the Constitution, the power to decide the time and manner of holding federal elections belongs to the state legislature, with potentially some oversight role from Congress in some of the laws that Michael talked about at the beginning, but there's no rule for state courts. That is a radical doctrine that is not consistent with the text of the Constitution. It's not consistent with historical understanding, but it does clearly have the appeal to at least some of the conservative justices. What we are doing, we are, I don't want to say too much about that because we're sort of actively in the process, a number of organizations of working on this case, and there will be a number of briefs filed to point out just how inconsistent this would be with constitutional traditions and really with the idea of democracy. You can't have a court sort of say that one branch and only one branch of the state government gets to make all these decisions, especially because that same court has allowed that branch of the state government, the state legislature, to be so gerrymandered that actually it does not represent a majority of the people. So it's not really a democratic institution. So we are going to push back, and we were going to do our very best to show the court that this would just be a bridge too far and it would be a fundamentally illegitimate decision. It is a very, very important case and one that we will be watching very closely.
Yeah, and Michael, I know later, I'm going to come back to you after I go to Cecile. I know this is a real preoccupation of yours, so I'll what?
This is my day job.
Yeah, no, you have a call to talk about that, but let's talk about Florida. We talk about voter suppression. There's also voter intimidation, and you mentioned this election protection police. Which is sort of sounds scary on its face when you think about election day. We usually associate elections with nice people sitting behind tables asking us our names and helping us to vote. What is going on with that down there? What have they done so far? What are your fears for election day? And what can you do about it?
Well, first of all, Florida has a law that prohibits having law enforcement in polling places because of our terrible history of violence and allowing the Klan to hurt people and the massacres that we've had in our state, one being at Ocoee in Central Florida that people are learning more about because one person wanted to vote. They massacred, over 60 people and burnt their homes down and their businesses. So because of our history, Florida enacted this law. So this whole thing about the election police is really going in the opposite direction, in the wrong direction. And because you have this force of people who believe the lies about improper voting and elections being stolen, they're busy looking for things that don't exist. And so a person can make an accusation and all of a sudden their neighbor or someone they don't like or the supervisor of election, you can be accused of doing something wrong, and just having the election police, who are Florida Department of Law Enforcement officers, turn up and ask questions. Maybe you have to get a lawyer. Maybe your job is in danger. It's just, it is a very threatening thing. And the governor chose to have a big press conference during our primary, just before the primaries, and they arrested 20 people who had finished their incarceration. They had felony convictions, most of whom had been told by a governmental entity, you can register to vote. And so they were so happy they did. And so one older gentleman was taken out of his home in his underwear. He wasn't even allowed to put on his clothing. There was a SWAT team and there was a helicopter. It seems to be a lot of staging to address the fears and to build up a base of support when there are many other violations of people voting twice that were not treated in the same way. Those people who voted twice, they happened to vote for President Trump, former President Trump twice. And what about, they are getting misdemeanors and they're able to, get a probation and their record's going to be cleared. Not one of them had a SWAT team. And they knew about those. What about the people who changed people's party affiliation without their knowledge, changing it that we know to a Republican? Nothing's been said about those. Where's the SWAT team? So it's the way it's already been utilized in terms of the enforcement mechanisms has been very one-sided. And there is a lot of fear in communities. I was just at a conference of the Florida Rights Restoration Coalition, and they work with returning citizens, and that was discussed a great deal. We don't want to stop people from even trying to learn if they can vote, if the penalty is going to be go back to prison.
Thank you very much. Could I very briefly just ask you a follow-up on the law? We're going to be talking a lot about southern states so far. I just want to shout out Jennifer Howard, who in the chat points out, please don't think that only southern states are the perpetrators of voter suppression. These problems exist in other places in the country too, which we can get to. But in Florida, the voters of Florida passed a referendum to change the Constitution to allow former felons to vote. And the legislature has almost entirely undercut that. Very briefly, can you talk about that? Because that's a particularly depressing thing, because here the voters said one thing, and the legislature has made it almost impossible to achieve the will of the voters. And no
Absolutely.
one said that that was a fraudulent election, by the way. You know?
No, it's extremely bitter, horrible pill, because the citizens' initiatives are based on, it's direct democracy. You are hearing from the people, and it's not easy. You got to get out there, you're sweating, you're getting petitions signed, you get it on the ballot, you try to advise, encourage people to vote for it. It got passed by a majority of the people. And I want to tell you, I asked many people, and I would ask white and black, regardless of whether they were wearing a Confederate t-shirt or not. And it didn't matter. The majority of people, regardless of their background and economic, they said, give them a second chance. So this is the will of all of the people. And so to have the legislators come back with Senate Bill 7066 and cut back and say, oh no, you have to pay all of your fines and fees. That was never contemplated. And so one of our judges in the trial said, at the trial level, because we challenged it, he said that was a poll tax. And so it was cut back, and then on appeal, we lost again. And so that's where it lies. We are trying to develop different tools to work around that. And I will talk about that, I guess, in what can we do about it session, part of this conversation. But we are essentially soliciting volunteers to read, primarily criminal defense lawyers or those who want to learn about it. And we have 2 CLEs that you can learn about how to read people's sentences to be able to advise them, can they vote? And there's a methodology to modify the sentence. So there is a very slow and painful step-by-step way to try to address it.
Yeah, one of the horrors is that they say you need to pay your fines, and in many cases, the state can't even locate what fines they owe. And so it's a catch 22 squared or something. Michael, I'd like to do 3 things with you. I know you feel passionately about this state legislature's doctrine case, and so I want you to feel free to talk about that. But I'd also like to bring in Georgia and perhaps some other states. Georgia, as you know, passed very restrictive voting laws, but turnout for the primaries this year was quite high. So there is talk saying, well, gee, I guess it's not so bad. What do you make of that talk? What do you make of that high turnout? And are there any other states we ought to be particularly thinking about?
It's hard to know the impact of specific laws on turnout. It's also early. Remember that the primaries were mostly on the Republican side in Georgia, and the goal of those laws were not to suppress Republican votes mostly. And the law also got softened as it went through. But it's hard to point to a particular law and say, well, this affected turnout this way or that affected turnout that way, when there are very high turnout elections and a lot at stake. And we've seen, certainly since the Supreme Court's ruling in the Dobbs case, especially, which was the case that overturned Roe v. Wade, very significant voter interest in this election. So it will be hard to draw a straight line between turnout and these laws. If these laws don't affect turnout, that would be a very high class problem to have. I think the question to look at is whose turnout gets affected. I would like to rant and rave a little bit about the independent state legislature case, though. I'll be like the Obama anger translator, if you remember that from a few years ago. To call it a theory is very generous. It is fan fiction. This is the notion that only state legislatures get the power in our system under our Constitution over elections with no checks and balances from state constitutions and state courts, from state governors signing and vetoing bills, from voters passing ballot initiatives like the ballot initiative that was passed in Florida with 64% of the vote, that only the state legislators get to, is without any foundation. James Madison insisted on putting the provision in the Constitution that this relates to, because he knew that state legislatures would be engaged, as he said in his notes, in abuses, and that they would pass laws designed to make it so their own faction would win. He knew they explicitly did this to stop gerrymandering and to stop voter suppression. They didn't call it that in those days, of course. No Supreme Court ruling has ever found this. In fact, the court has ruled against this over and over again. It would cause chaos. And as you say, at least 4 of the current justices are ISLT curious at the very least. There was a brief filed in the case last week that is pretty substantial and pretty significant. You know, you might have seen that former federal judge Michael Ludig, who testified before the January 6th committee, very esteemed conservative judge. He said that the independent state legislature theory was an attempt to steal the next election. There was a brief last week in the case that I hope and think may be a game changer. It came in from the Conference of Chief Justices of the state Supreme Courts in all 50 states across the United States, Republicans and Democrats alike. It purported to say, we don't take a position, you know, these briefs come in, some of them are for one side, others are for the other side. This one says it doesn't take a position on which side it's on. It says we don't take a position, but the independent state legislature theory is a grave threat to American democracy and would be a complete catastrophe if you did it. And because among other things, it would take away the state court's ability to enforce the right to vote. You asked early on, is there a right to vote in the US Constitution? I have a somewhat different view on this. It's mentioned 5 times in the US Constitution, just always in the amendments. And of course, when the Constitution was first written, there was slavery, women could not vote, only white men who owned property could vote. But we have referenced the right to vote over and over and over again in the US Constitution. We need courts among others to enforce that right. But in all but one of the 50 states, there is a much more explicit right to vote in state constitutions than there is in the US Constitution. And one of the things that this Moore versus Harper case would do is choke off the ability of state courts to enforce that right to vote in federal elections. It would be Citizens United times Shelby County on steroids in its impact on American democracy if it goes the wrong way. There are different ways it could go the wrong way, but in the worst version, that would be the case.
First of all, I want to thank you on the voting business. I was just quoting the line that I will never forget, the first sentence of Bush v. Gore, which said there is no right to vote for president of the United States, obviously referring to the Electoral College, which is still true. But you're absolutely right. And particularly the Civil War amendments and the 15th Amendment are important. And I think sometimes the court wants to forget about the Civil War amendments. Let's go around about, we have a bunch of questions out there that relate to the number of candidates for governor and secretary of state around the country who are explicit election deniers, who say they're going to do something about the next election. Congressman Castro, let me start with you on that. Tell us about concerns about that in this election. What should we be thinking about that? I think the people in the audience who put that on our agenda here.
We should be profoundly concerned, deeply concerned about it. Texas has one of them now, a Secretary of State, who has shown an inclination towards these theories and met with different folks who were involved in the conspiracy theories. So a Secretary of State has a lot of power over how the people of Texas, in this case, get to vote. For example, the polling places where you're gonna allow for voting, the closing of polling places, fundamental things like that. And then, of course, the certification of the election, the overall certification of election. And so there should be a deep concern among everyone about the ability of election deniers in key positions to cause a lot of harm to our democracy and threaten future elections.
And what about laws? I'll go to Sam or Cecile or Michael on this. Laws that have really allowing elected partisan officials to intervene in vote counting, where the state legislatures basically giving themselves the power in Georgia to take over local boards of election, and in other ways to insinuate themselves into a process that wasn't formally nonpartisan. We ought to have nonpartisan elections in the country, but we don't. But in general, this process, as the 2020 election showed, goes on. It's pretty much friends and neighbors. In the old days, I know my late mother-in-law's good friend was a Republican, and they were the joint election judges. My mother-in-law was a Democrat, her friend was a Republican, and everybody in the neighborhood was their friends, and so they wanted them to vote. But this is really pernicious what is being proposed. Can you talk about that, Sam? Not more than proposed; it's actually in law in some places.
I think this was one of the other ways in which the 2020 election was disturbing signal of potentially what is to come. And we saw there were real efforts by former President Trump and his allies and surrogates to put pressure on those involved in the vote counting process. There was a dramatic moment in Michigan where those responsible for a real ministerial act in terms of certifying the results suggested that, well, perhaps they weren't going to certify the election results in Wayne County and in Detroit in particular. And I think even went so far as to say, well, maybe we could certify the rest of the county and not Detroit for no legitimate reason whatsoever. And so this was a real disturbing change. I think that, I guess I'd want to go back to something that Michael said, which is that, and to something that you were just talking about as well, which is that there actually are provisions of the Voting Rights Act of 1965 that happily we have not had to rely on as much in recent years that are relevant here as well. And actually one of the lawsuits that the Legal Defense Fund filed in the wake of the 2020 election, or towards the end of the 2020 election, was a lawsuit actually against former President Trump in light of what happened in Michigan, saying that this effort to sort of thwart the will of the voters through the certification process or the vote counting process was a denial of the right to vote protected by the Voting Rights Act and a denial of Section 11B of the Voting Rights Act. So all that is to say, without getting into the details of each specific state law, I do think these laws are very concerning. I do think, though, it's important for us to all be clear that the notion that the state legislature, sort of has untrammeled power here is not true. And as long as every state continues to say that and have laws that they are going to choose presidential electors based on the outcome of the popular vote, I think it would be a violation of both the federal constitution and the Voting Rights Act for some state after the fact to just say, well, we're not happy with the results, so we're not going to count the votes fairly. So absolutely something to be incredibly focused on and looking into. But I do think that there are important federal laws at play that we should not lose sight of as well.
I'd like to ask Cecile, what are you guys doing given these realities to deal with the next, less than 2 months? What can a citizen do is the basic question. It's the kind of question legal women voters have been asked for a long, long time.
Well, we've been working on voter protection and we've been educating citizens and new volunteers. We had an attorney come down from the Legal Defense Fund, and we had a lot of people get trained so they know how to use the tools to report anything that seems untoward. If people are coming out, they're upset, and just try to track and inform people. We have a lot of GOTV events. We are doing education, we're doing outreach, and a lot of groups are coming to us. A lot of groups are seeing what's going on. I mean, we're talking about fraternities and sororities, churches, sometimes groups that have not in the past been as focused on direct civic engagement. They participate, but they haven't necessarily come to the league. We're getting a lot of door knocks. Hey, you know, what's going on? Can you explain redistricting? Can you explain what the voter suppression is? Can you explain how we do proper voter registration? So the citizens are watching and the citizens are concerned and they are asking for our help, and we're just thrilled to be there for them, but it is a little bit of a strain, you know, trying to meet everybody's needs. So I had put in the chat that I would suggest, if people are concerned, find an organization that you would like to support and get involved with membership, donation, time. We're asking for volunteer lawyers to help people look at their records. I myself looked at 13 records, not only creating the program. I want to tell you, 3 people of the 13, they didn't even have felonies. They had not been voting for over 10 years because they were charged with a felony, but they didn't know it had been dismissed or misdemeanor. So a little bit of legal education in these realms where many of the people have a 7th grade, 5th grade level of reading can really help. That's the thing. Let's everybody get involved and roll up your sleeves. You don't have to be an expert. There are sources you can get involved with, plug into, and you can help.
By the way, there were a lot of questions on the chat about how I can get involved in these Secretary of State races. I do not want to endanger Class Act's 501c3 status. I will only say that there's a whole lot of information. So rather than ask anybody to answer that question, I'm just going to say there's an enormous amount of organizing around those races, and it's all very visible online to find out about. Michael, you have written a book on this, and a very good book on this. This is very much about action today, but it's also a lot of people who care about history. Can you locate this moment we're at in history for us, and how, you know, this is a new way of doing things that we have indeed done in the past, and we've had to fight these fights over and over again. Just put that in a little bit of perspective. And then Congressman Castro, I really would like you to talk about what it's like to campaign in this environment. You know, how do you go about, you know, it's not just vote, it's make sure you vote, it's make a plan to vote. It's what's it like to campaign in this? So let me go to Michael on the first and you on the second. And again, keep your questions coming because they've been very good.
Thank you, EJ. Yes, you know, I did a book a few years ago called The Fight to Vote, which was really a history of all of this. And it is not really unusual that we're having this conversation. It's been the case that we've been debating how people vote and what it means from the beginning of the country. It's noteworthy that just last week, an NBC News poll showed for the first time that the state of American democracy was the #1 issue. And there have been some other polls that were similar. Some of that is a function of the January 6th committee and many other things. But there have been other times in the country's history where these kinds of issues have been what we fight about. It's often been very partisan, and that shouldn't be a surprise either. The book starts with the Declaration of Independence, which didn't just break with Great Britain, but which said that government was legitimate. It said only if it rests on the consent of the governed. And that was a radical idea at the time. And in that spring of 1776, as I mentioned before, only white men who owned property could vote. But the radical democratic, small d democratic ideals of the Declaration of Independence, as hypocritical as the people were, given that so many of them were enslavers, began to take on a life of its own. And in the new states, newly independent states, started writing constitutions. And in Pennsylvania, Benjamin Franklin wrote that state's new constitution. And the first thing they did was they eliminated the property requirement for voting so that poor and working class men of all races could vote. And Ben Franklin was asked why he did that. And he said, well, there's a man who owns a jackass. It's worth $50. So the man can vote. Then the jackass dies. The man is older, the man is wiser, but the jackass is dead, so the man cannot vote. So who, Ben Franklin asked, who really has the right to vote, the man or the jackass? Pretty good explanation. Up in Massachusetts, John Adams was writing their constitution that same spring of 1776. And he was urged, do the say, hey, why don't you do that thing they did down in Pennsylvania? And he take away the property requirement. He was aghast. He said, if we do that, women will demand the right to vote. Lads of 18 will demand the right to vote, and men who have not a farthing to their name will think themselves worthy of an equal voice in government, and they will demand the right to vote. John Adams said, there will be no end of it. And of course, he was right. There is no end of it. That same fight between the democratizing impulse and those who, for whatever reason, would pull up the ladder. That's the fight we've been having ever since.
Thank you. And everyone in the audience is going to remember the jackass story. That's terrific. Congressman, talk about campaigning right now, and how is this different, and how much attention it strikes me that one of the worst things about making it hard to vote is how much money it requires campaigns to turn out vote, to make sure how much money we have to spend on voter protection, and all kinds of efforts that need to be made that ought not to be something that we need to worry about. Can you talk about that in this climate?
Yeah, I mean, I think that just, in terms of context, I'm in my 20th year in public service. So I got elected when I was 28 and took office when I was 28, and I turned 48 this Friday. And
happy birthday.
Thank you. And campaigning and office holding, I feel like, has just changed incredibly during that 20 years. Because in 2002, there was no social media at all. So, if they say you needed thick skin to run for office, now you need Teflon, basically, oftentimes. But the very raw, sometimes intimidating political environment of today makes it harder to engage people. And let me give you a few direct examples of that. And also the voter suppression efforts make it harder to engage people. So 2 quick examples. I found that after January 6th in this election cycle, a lot more people are reluctant to display their political allegiance. So they're reluctant to put up campaign signs, reluctant to put a bumper sticker on their car, to wear a campaign t-shirt. And they're reluctant to do that because of what they perceive as hostility or raw anger, or the possibility of some kind of physical confrontation from somebody because of what they believe. And that's not good for democracy. The idea that there are folks that are thinking twice about something as basic to our democracy as that. And then with regard to voter suppression, what's happened in Texas, and I would imagine in Florida and other states that have passed these voter suppression laws, is that it's created a kind of confusion that can lead to paralysis. So for example, for years and years, you would have a daughter or son that would help their elderly parent go and help them fill out their mail ballot and vote by mail, or take them to the poll and go into the voting booth with them, or the machine now, and help them pick out their candidates who they wanted to vote for. We found over the last few years that there are a lot of people, because of the criminal penalties involved, that are paralyzed and don't know exactly whether they should be doing that or not, or certainly not just family members, but neighbors who used to help elderly neighbors go vote are now paralyzed and don't want to take the chance that I don't want to help with a mail ballot, or I don't want to break the law. So a lot of this stuff, whether it's the rawness of the politics or the voter suppression laws, has had the effect of, I think in some ways, of disengaging people. Right now, I realize that in 2020 election there was a record turnout, but I still believe that these events and these laws have curtailed, I think, some of the energy and some of the willingness of some folks, especially people that have not engaged in the political process before, of actually getting out there and being part of it, or at least being publicly part of it, because of this raw environment that we're in now today.
We got a couple of good questions out there that I want to sort of invite any of you to answer. One is on various voting reforms, ranked choice voting, electoral college reform. As some of you know, I've proposed a mandatory participation along Australian lines. I don't want to hijack this. We can do that after the election because we got enough work to do now. I'd love you to talk about mail voting, which is spread to 5 states now, all mail voting, for example. And then the second thing I'd like to ask, which somebody asked about, and this goes again to the campaigning question, we really don't have election day anymore. You know, we have an election season with early voting, which is a good thing, in my view, because it expands opportunities for people to vote, but it changes the nature of the campaign. So who wants to take up reform proposals? Michael, do you want to go with that?
Well, ranked choice voting is pretty interesting because one of the arguments for it is that it tends to lead to less polarization and less candidates from the extreme wings of their parties winning. And interestingly, in New York City, which was probably before Alaska, the highest profile use of ranked choice voting, I was always a little worried about ranked choice voting because I thought it was so complicated. And most people don't really have opinions on 7 candidates deep or whatever. But it is the case that in the primaries in New York, it worked well, and that actually the most moderate of the candidates for mayor, Eric Adams, won. There's a lot to study there. I'll mention one reform which has not been particularly partisan, but which would have a pretty significant impact, which is automatic voter registration. We're one of the only countries, we all are used to this, we're one of the only countries where you have to register yourself to vote. And when you move, you fall off the rolls, and there's all kinds of shenanigans about that. That keep people off the rolls. And it's a system that was put in place a century ago to keep people from voting. And if you had automatic registration, in other words, everybody who's eligible is on the rolls, it would add about 50 million people to the rolls permanently and cost less. The Brennan Center, which I lead, as you know, developed the proposal for automatic voter registration over a decade ago. It's now the law in 17 states. It was in that legislation that almost passed Congress, and it has passed in Republican and Democratic states and purple states and on ballot initiatives. And it's made a big difference in getting people registered. Some of these kinds of very simple things can help build the bonds of citizenship and move it from being just a political plaything.
Yeah, amen to that, an automatic voter registration. I also think election day registration is a powerful potential reform, particularly for young people, that our system systematically discriminates against young people because they move around a lot more.
And it doesn't help or hurt either party.
Right. But you just show up and with some proof and you can register, and it makes it, participation is much higher in states that have election day registration. Sam, you're more a litigator than a lawmaker, but I bet you have some ideas on this front.
Yeah, I think it's hard to choose a single one, but I guess what I would say thematically is that the experience for voting in this country depends so much on sort of who you are, where you live, and it is not acceptable that in state after state, to choose 2 examples, Florida and Georgia, that Black voters who vote in person have to wait much, much, much longer than white voters. And there are a whole host of reforms that could be implemented. Some, these sort of big ticket things, and some are just about making sure that there are adequate numbers of polling places, that states cannot sort of discriminate in where polling places are located and how polling places are provided, making sure that there are enough days of early voting, all these sorts of things. Every American should be able to vote and should be able to vote easily. Nobody should be able to be in hotlines for hours and hours. Nobody should be forced to take time off of work and, perhaps an hourly job so that they can participate in democracy. The bottom line is that voting really needs to be easy for everybody, and it fundamentally is not.
Right. The commission that President Obama appointed, a bipartisan commission, said it was the most simple radical reform, which is no one should have to wait more than half an hour to vote. And most people don't, but the people who do usually have to wait a lot more. The other reform I like, which is now possible with computers, in Australia, you can vote at any polling place in your state. You can just go. And I think that we could make that a lot easier here. You could go near work. You could go when you're going to the mall. Well, we don't have malls anymore. They're closing down at a rapid pace. But when you're out shopping or something, there are different ways to do it. Congressman Castro, your favorite reforms, and Cecile.
Well, I'm going to go with something a little bit different, which is to finally end gerrymandering after all of these decades.
Amen. Yeah.
an independent redistricting commissions, and you would have to have one of those things where everybody unilaterally disarms at once, right? So that it makes sense. But it's been proven to work in both red and blue states. And that by itself would empower so many folks and would change the composition of Congress and would just create a fairer process for everyone.
Although you've seen states adopt it and then legislatures override it. How do you get it to stick? I mean, that hasn't happened everywhere. California's made it work, for example. But how do you fight that?
I mean, there is a real temptation of politicians to draw their own districts. That's incredibly tempting for people to want to do. But really, that is a power that belongs to the electorate, to the people, and really shouldn't rest with the elected officials who really, whether you're Republican or Democrat, your first instinct is to preserve your electability. And that gets in the way of the rest.
Cecile,
go ahead.
This is just like a piece of nice steak I need to get onto. And I want to point out that the United States Supreme Court, in the Rucho case, they elevated and held out the Florida's of our Fair Districts amendments as the way to go. If states want to get rid of political gerrymandering, because that was the case where they said, we're not going to clean up your mess. If you're doing mess, don't come to the federal courts. We're not going to fix your political gerrymandering. And they said, if you want to fix it, look at the Fair Districts amendments in the state of Florida. And they actually cited a league case when we won, and we were one of the plaintiffs in the case with our allies. But they said, this is enforceable, this is clear, and this is what you should do. And so the people, as you had said earlier, had spoken on the issue of prohibiting racial gerrymandering, minority language-based gerrymandering, and political gerrymandering. And you're right. That is the status of state of the law, which the United States Supreme Court said, this is the way to go. So I would be interesting for me to see that same Supreme Court with a few different justices say, we're not going to enforce something that comes from the states that prohibits this, because they told us to do it just a few years ago. So I'm, curious about that. And of course, our governor provided his own version of a redistricting map, which directly violated the very Fair Districts and the Voting Rights Act and other things. And his excuse was, well, I think the law is going to change, and our legislators caved after a veto. And so we are in Florida, even though we have the Fair Districts amendments that the Supreme Court said were wonderful, we have, our governor and legislators basically cannibalizing the work of the citizens. So we are concerned, and we're in litigation on that issue also.
I just wanted to get through a couple of quick questions that are online here. One is this, I'm just going to read it. The Southeast has many HBCUs, also with Roe v. Wade reversal. Are we seeing big increases in engagement in swing votes and involvement from these groups? Someone asked, does any organization register nursing home residents and the homeless to vote? I guess we are close to the end, so that I really do want to get at, and I don't want to go over your question, Marion, back there, but what can people out there do between now and Election Day? So I throw out those two questions because they were up in the Q&A, but also the people listening actually want fair elections. They want to make it easy for people to vote. They want elections to go well in their communities. What do you have to say to them? I don't know who's gone. Cecile, why don't you start? You haven't had a chance to start yet.
Okay. Well, yes, there are organizations that go into nursing homes and can register to vote. The League has done it many times. We often try to work with our local supervisors of elections that are elected county by county. And we have said, hey, if you're not going to go in, we'll do it. and we go in and we register the people and we make that effort. So that is something that voting rights organizations and volunteers can do to make sure. I've registered many homeless people, because when we do our voter registration, someone comes up. What people do in Florida is you can use the homeless, the place where people can go to stay for a temporary time. That can be their address. So there are, in Florida anyway, there are ways to reach out to people who you're worried that they're going to be left out. It's not easy. It's you know, it's intensive work, but there are ways to do it.
Sam, what on these and what people can do?
Yeah, I'll just, I think, sort of close on the what people can do. And I put this in the chat, but I think volunteering to be an election worker is tremendously important. We've seen a real shortage at times of election workers, and it's a very difficult environment. And so it's a really important thing that you can do. And I put a resource there. Volunteering to monitor what's happening. I put a link into LDF's Prepare to Vote team, which Cecile gave a shout out to. Sort of, we sort of work together in different ways, but there are a number of organizations. The Lawyers Committee has a very, very significant network as well, where you can volunteer to be involved in monitoring either in person or remotely. And then if you're a lawyer, a resource that I also put in is if you want to represent an election worker who is facing, perhaps some sort of confusion with one of the new state laws, or even harassment or intimidation, volunteering to provide pro bono services to election workers, I think is tremendously important as well.
Michael?
We're less than 60 days away from the election. And the most important thing, in addition to what folks have said, is when candidates come to you, when they come for your support, when they come for your vote, ask them what they're going to do to save democracy in our country.
Thank you. And Congressman?
Sure. Well, it's been a wonderful discussion. Thank you all for hosting it. Our democracy is in peril right now, and it is on a precipice. And so vote for people who support democracy, who will stand up for democracy. But also I want to challenge y'all to be part of a relational organizing in your home states. One of the things we found over the years that keeps people from getting involved in grassroots politics is that they don't want to reach out to strangers. They don't want to cold call somebody in a phone bank or go knock on somebody's door. Relational organizing is about reaching out to the people in your own world, your friends, your family, the people you're comfortable with. And now in probably 14 or 15 states, there are serious efforts to do that. And I believe it's effective. And then finally, our democratic psyche as a country has taken a real beating over the last few years. And you can see it in a lot of folks. But I would ask folks not to give in to cynicism and not to be paralyzed by fear of the future, and to continue to vote and encourage their friends and their family members to go vote. That we can beat back this wave of authoritarianism that we see, and creeping fascism, I believe, that we see if we continue to vote.
I just want to close, and then I want to bring Marion in. I want to close and thank this inspiring panel. I was involved in and I told this to the organizers when we started talking about this conversation, in a congressional campaign 50 years ago. Yeah, I'm getting old like the rest of us. And we had what I always thought was one of the most aggressive voter registration posters ever, where we had a picture of Hitler, a picture of Stalin, and a picture of Mao. And the slogan over the top said, people who don't care enough to vote can always find somebody to do it for them. And if you don't do it, if you don't defend democracy, it's not going to be defended. And I'm really grateful to everyone who joined this call out of concern for the state of our democracy. And I really want to thank Marion and her whole crew for organizing it. And I kick it over to you, Marion.
Thank you very much, EJ. And Class Act has a calls to action. And our most important one is reiterating what you've said all along, is you can volunteer with a Get Out to Vote organization in your state, such as the League of Women Voters or other organizations, and these are on our list. On our website, we have a list called Voting Activism Opportunities. So we encourage you to go on our website and look for that. You can also be helpful in key states like Texas, Georgia, Florida, Arizona, North Carolina, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin, because you can do things even if you don't live in those states. So take a look at our resources for that. So we thank you so much. And if you run into friends, remind them, and other community members, remind them to vote. It's important that we try to preserve our democracy. So I'd like to thank you, EJ, and our esteemed panelists for taking the time for this forum and sharing your great insights. And you can see from the chat how engaged our community has been this evening. Thanks also go to the members of our program and production teams, Ryan O'Connell, Donna Brown-Guillaume, Sarah Ulrich, Sarah Greenberg, Jackie Swearingen, Therese Steiner, Johnson Lightfoot, Katie Marinelli, Kate Freed, and Diana Labanchu, and to our videographer, Rick Brotman. And finally, to all of you who joined us this evening. This is our 18th Class Act HR 73 forum since we started in March 2020, and we encourage you to visit our website and view the videos and resources of our 17 previous Zoom forums. On October 20th, we invite you to join us for our next forum, Half Earth, Conserving Biodiversity from the Deep Sea to Mount Everest, with moderators Jesse Osabel and John Kress, and panelists Brat Coburn, Sharon Tischer, and Dean Wang, all experts in the field and members of the Harvard Radcliffe class of 1973. Thank you all, and good evening.